right, everyone. Welcome to the STOA. Today's session is called Black Feminism and Womanism, Soulful Critique in a Pivotal Time. Our three guests today, Loretta Ross, Imani Perry, and Toni M, will be introduced in a moment by our moderator today, the one and only Greg Thomas. Greg is the CEO and co-founder of the Jazz Leadership Project. One of the brilliant minds in this meta-modern integral space. He's at the intersection of a lot of things. And Greg is the one that arranged today's session, and I will tag him in a moment. But before I do, just to, if everyone can turn off their cameras except the guest and Greg today, because then that will help the YouTube video pick it up, and we'll call you back during the Q&A portion. And the Q&A protocols, if you've been here before, you understand the drill. But if you have any questions that come alive anytime when you're listening to the conversation, put them in the chat, have question in front of it. And then Greg will take me in for the Q&A portion. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself. You can ask your question to the panel. This will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and then I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, I will hand it over to Greg. The STOA is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our illustrious guests. For me, it's been a long time coming. I've wanted to do this ever since doing the series Body and Soul, the Mind of Culture. And I think that the time is very appropriate for what we'll be talking about and with whom we'll be doing it. So what I'd like to do is do a little different introduction. I'm going to hand it off to Imani Perry, who will do the honors for introducing, we have a multi-generational array of guests, and she's going to introduce the revered elder of the guests, of our group of guests, Loretta Ross. So I hand it off to you, Imani.
Thank you so much. It is my great honor to introduce Professor, human rights activist, and movement leader Loretta J. Ross. For over 40 years, she has been at the very cutting edge of the fight for reproductive justice and human rights. If you name any significant gathering in feminist movement history over the past 4 decades, she was either there in person, often leading the charge, or invoked by organizers and participants for her groundbreaking work. Among her numerous distinctions are having served as the leader of the National Organization for Women of Color Programs, the National Black Women's Health Project, the National Center for Human Rights Education, as a co-founder of Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. And relatedly, she is one of the people who coined both the term women of color and reproductive justice in order to both expand and deepen the focus of feminist organizing. Professor Ross has also gifted us with editing and writing numerous books that provide critical insight into the field of reproductive justice. Of course, I would say, and I think many others would agree, any serious consideration of feminist thought as an educator or an organizer must include her work. I'm sorry, I have to go on a bit, but this is only a small fraction of her accomplishments. Ross has received numerous awards and distinctions. But part of what I want to say today about her is that one of the reasons her work resonates so deeply with so many of us is that she allowed us into her life, her personal stories with racism, misogyny, intimate violence, medical violence, and led us toward the process of both healing and seeking justice through her testimony. It's been a demonstration of enormous care for us, her people, that sits alongside her brilliance and commitment. Currently a professor at Smith College, her next book, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, promises to shake things up pretty significantly in this moment in which so often it seems that there's more energy spent on criticism than cultivating community. And she describes the book as a rethinking of how we communicate with each other about the issues that matter most, and offers practical guidance to explore how we process our pain, forge our relationships, and access our joy, even as we combat oppression. I cannot wait for that one, and I am honored to be in conversation with Professor Ross.
Professor Ross, please unmute yourself.
One of these days I'll learn how to use Zoom. But thank you, Imani. That was a wonderful introduction. I think that my life is a testament to Black feminist praxis, because we believe that our living stories are the things we develop theory behind. It's not that theory has to meet reality, it's the reality develops the theory for us as Black feminists. And I know that's certainly my life, and it's certainly the life that I would ascribe also to Toni Bond. Um, so should I do Toni's introduction now, Greg?
Please, yes, you should.
I first met Toni when she was director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. She was the first Black woman to serve as the director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. And that's when there weren't a lot of Black women who were front and center and nationally known for their leadership in the abortion rights movement, because it was largely seen as a white women's issue. But Toni came through this work also through her lived experience. After having had abortions, she felt that she could best serve the community by helping women access the resources that they needed in Chicago to access abortions themselves. And then she went on to serve on the board of the National Network of Abortion Funds, which oversaw the development of a national network of abortion access services for women of color in particular, because of the lack of financial resources and the existence of the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits using federal funds for paying for abortions. And so Toni has always been in the leadership of addressing this healthcare discrimination, because what services you should not depend on who's paying for your health insurance. And so Toni has always led that fight. But I got to know her very well when she joined Sister Song. When we went beyond our first original 16 organization, her organization by then was Black Women for Reproductive Justice, which actually started out as African American Women Evolving, and it then became Black Women for Reproductive Justice, because their organization really make us break up that 444 rigidity that we had, because we couldn't leave Toni's organization out of the collective, even though we didn't have a concomitant, Native American, Latina, or API organization we wanted to bring in. So she helped us restructure our work. She ran BWRJ, Black Women for Reproductive Justice, for close to 2 decades, and then decided to go to school to finish her education, and recently was awarded a PhD in, I never get it right, ethics, religion, and I guess womanist theory. I probably butchered it, but those are the things that I know her for. But I also know her because she was with me and 10 other women in 1994 when we co-created the theory of reproductive justice. So she's one of the founding mothers as well. And she's a different generation from me. She's roughly about the age of my son. So I really enjoy the fact that not only are Black women standing on the shoulders of people who came before us, like Rosa Parks. A lot of people don't know Rosa Parks was on the board of Planned Parenthood, for example. But that we continue the legacy by having women like Toni and Imani take up the struggle, because we know Black women will not be free until we take care of that ourselves, because no one prioritizes us. We have to prioritize ourselves. And so I really enjoy the way that Toni is expanding reproductive justice theory in the field of religion, ethics, and womanism in a way that I am just enjoying. And I won't embarrass her and make her blush about all the stories that I can tell about how I enjoy the retelling of biblical stories through a reproductive justice lens, but she's an expert on that, the leading expert in the country, and I'm proud to know her.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Please unmute yourself, Toni. I just want to say that when when Loretta suggested that you join this conversation today, she did share with me some of the biblical references and the terms in which she actually describes it, which makes you blush. So I won't repeat it, but I know what she's talking about when she says that. So I would like you to please share some thoughts about your friend and colleague, Loretta, and about your own work.
There are a number of ways that Loretta makes me blush. You will never get me to say it, but there are a number of ways she makes me blush. I remember, and I don't know, Loretta, if you remember, but I remember that day we were in Chicago when we first met like it was yesterday. And being in that hotel room with you, I think we were in the hotel room until like 3 o'clock in the morning, working on crafting this language for this ad about Black women and universal health care reform and what reproductive justice looked like through a human rights lens. But one of the things that I love about Loretta is that many of us can say that Loretta gave us our first. So my very first trip to South Africa was with Loretta. Loretta is very supportive of young people's leadership development, particularly women of color. And we have this saying about Loretta: if you suggest something, you should be prepared to take the lead on it. Because when you suggest it, one of the first things she will say is, oh, so that means that you're going to take the lead on this? But Loretta is a brilliant thinker. Her contributions to Black feminist theory, to reproductive justice, we haven't even discussed her expertise in the field of human rights, is unsurpassable. And so when I think about Loretta, she is more than just my friend, but I look at her as a mentor. When I was on my PhD journey, it was Loretta. She was one of the folks that I would call and express my fears, express my sometimes doubts. And she was also the person that I would run things by. And that's what I think probably one of the greatest things I appreciate about her is that she's an amazing thought partner. Someone who you can bounce things off of. I get to bounce things off of her. I think we really look to each other for our insights. She always says I'm the more tactful of the two, which is probably right. Yeah. In terms of my work is really at the intersection of religion and reproductive justice. My PhD is in religion, ethics, and society. I am a womanist ethicist, trained heavily in womanist thought, womanist theology, and womanist ethics. My desire is to really think about how do we dismantle these reproductive politics, or what I call reproductive norms within the Black religious community, about how Black people should live their reproductive and sexual lives, more around how they should live their sexual lives. And also to push the Black community, particularly the Black religious community, to talk about those issues that are critically important, especially to Black women, since Black women comprise the majority of the attendees in most Black churches, and also because to not talk about issues of reproductive and sexual health for Black women within the Black church completely invisibilizes us. So that's where my work is situated. And lastly, I'll just say I love working with Loretta, because not only does she encourage you, but she challenges you. And that challenge, I think, when she challenges you, that also contributes to your growth.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Toni. And thank you, Loretta.
Can I
Now,
just interrupt for a minute? Because I think I need to give some praise to Imani too.
oh, I love that. I mean,
You
yes,
know,
I was just about to give a little bio and do the same thing. So yes, let's cause her to blush
well,
by doing just that. Yes.
yeah, I did not know Imani, and I don't know if we've actually been in the same room together, but there's a lot of writers who take your breath away. And then there are those writers that give it back. And you're
Mm.
one of those writers that give it back. Your words and your writing about reproductive health rights and justice issues just leaped off the page. So I don't even do social media, and I made sure I follow you so that I could see whatever else you were putting pen to paper, and in terms of your brilliant legal analyses and the way that you make them so accessible to people. I just want to honor you for your scholarship and your brilliance, and the fact that old girls like me find something, learn something every time I read an article of yours. And so I am so proud that we're in this conversation, because your brilliance, your scholarship, your leadership. But the other thing is not your credentials, it's the way your heart comes through in your writing. It is not the dry academic legalese stuff. It's about, again, you bring your lived experiences to the page too. And so you're following in the tradition of all the foremothers that came before you. So I just wanted to honor you before we got into the formal discussion, because some writers just, I can't resist wanting to read their stuff over and over again. And every time I do, I learn something new.
Mm.
Thank you.
Mm. Yes, I have to concur. I'm going to get into some of the points of her background, but I've got to say that what has touched me about Imani, uh, along with her brilliant mind, her big heart, is her relationship with her sons, which on Facebook, I felt like I know them, or I know them through the anecdotes that she tells on Facebook. Said this, he said that, and then when her latest work, Breathe, came out, and I listened to the audio book, I really felt like I got to know them and her as she told stories about her life as it interweaves with their life and their relationship, travels, history. It's just beautiful. So I would highly recommend that audio book, or the written text, but the audio book is in her voice. And, a lot of authors don't do that. So I would strongly urge people to check out that work. So
Thank you.
you're very welcome. And the full title is Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, which came out in 2019. So for those of you who may not know, Imani Perry was born to social activist parents in Birmingham, Alabama, just 9 years after the 16th Street Baptist church bombing. She's a scholar and author, and she grew up at a time of great change. At age 5, her family relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and her mother earned a doctorate at Harvard, while her own academic and literary ambitions started to take root. So today, she is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton, where she examines the rich layered interplay between history, race, law, and culture, with an emphasis on hip hop music, but also visual arts, jazz, drama. It's a wide range of aesthetic references and appreciation. Her interdisciplinary work is deeply reflective and also grounded in experience, as that's a theme we've already been sharing, her own and of those who came before her, and that of the next generation. Okay. And just so you all know, for those of you who need to know these kind of things, she has an undergraduate degree from Yale College in Literature and American Studies. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Harvard, a JD from Harvard Law School, and an LLM, from Georgetown. So homegirl has got it going on in many, many ways, on many, many levels. So it's just a pleasure for me to have you here, Imani, along with Loretta and Toni, and thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So I want to begin with you, and I want to begin with a book, one of your more recent books, one of the ones that came out a few years ago. And I have it here. It's called Vexy Thing on Gender and Liberation. But so folks can actually see it on the screen, I'm going to screen share it. And we're going to start our conversation with reference to it. Okay. So, all right. Now, okay. So this is, let me make it big so everybody can see this right. Okay. Okay. What I'd like to do is, Imani, I'd like you to discuss what we see here, because images are so powerful and they encapsulate so much. But before you do that, I'd like to share a quote from the introduction of the book. This is the end of one of the final paragraphs in the introduction. And what I'm going to do is read the sentences right before it, leading into it, so you really have a full context, and it'll give you a sense of what Loretta was talking about, her writing. It says, throughout this book, I use stories and historical vignettes as examples of the structure of patriarchy. These many narratives also serve as models of how we read layers of domination at work in a profoundly heterogeneous world. In each branch of the argument, at least one exemplum or example is available, and a reading provided by the author, but the exempla are also set forth as an invitation for alternative readings. In this way, this is a deliberately dialogic work. It is suggestive and exploratory rather than doctrinal or utopic. Art is critical in this project, visual art and literary, for exploring how the artistic imagination is rife with philosophical arguments about ethical, social, and intimate relations, and with the moral imagination of being in right relation with others in the world. For those who are familiar with what we call integral thought, that's an integral statement, y'all, okay? So, Imani, can you share with us further about your book, and in particular about the cover, which we see here? Thank you.
Thank you. So, you know, the book comes exactly from what we were already talking about, the sort of intergenerational Black feminist tradition. So part of what I was feeling when I wanted to write the book is, you know, I would go into a bookstore and you'd see at the front, you know, Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, like that was the next, you know, the one, you know, this incredibly wealthy woman, that's the vision of feminism. And then you'd go in the back of a bookstore, maybe in a corner, you'd see sort of Black feminism, woman of color feminism, right? And for me, as I was coming of age, I was nurtured in a Black feminist community, right? So, you know, members of Combahee, you know, writers, thinkers. My mother was a poet, a kind of robust. So for me, I encountered feminism as Black, right? With deep-rooted connection to Blackness. And people who were thinking through colonialism, capitalism, you know, hierarchies of dominate, all those sorts of things. So this work was my effort to do a theoretical text that took what I was reared in, was nurtured in, and gave it credit for actually thinking about everybody's liberation, right? So Black feminism had, I was born in 1972. In the 70s, the most robust account of the world, and yet was continually marginalized. And so this painting is by Leslie Sarr, Betty Sarr's daughter. And it, so that was another piece of the sort of sense of generations with the work. And it depicts a character who is also kind of travels across generations. So for people who read Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, there's a story of a mad woman in the attic, right, who is Caribbean. And Jean Rhys later sort of re-ups the story and imagines it from the imagination of the woman herself, where she came from, right? So sort of because in Jane Eyre's story, it's the first wife who is never seen, who's just this kind of, spectral presence. And Jean Rhys tried to match. So this is a kind of engagement with thinking about, the ways, for me, I mean, I don't want to speak for Sarr, but engage about the ways in which Black women are dominated, marginalized, placed up in the attic, lives and stories not deeply engaged. But then there's these sort of these roots, this rootedness. And so I just, it resonated so deeply with me. The question, and I'll say this, like, there's a lot that has changed about the world, the political economy, the structures of communication, but there are some persistent themes and ideologies that shape how, opportunity, life, violence are distributed in this world. And I do think if we begin, as people said long before I was here, we begin with Black women, we can actually unearth and also begin to solve the layers of domination. So that's the quick version. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the screen share now. And okay. And so to just take off from there, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to organize this, because I felt that in the space of the STOA, and this is just a statement, an observation, statement of fact, it's not a critique per se, but frankly, there wasn't a lot of sisters, and there weren't a lot of hardly any Black women who were guests. So I wanted to address that, because I'll give a quick example, then I want to just, let y'all have the floor. I was thinking about this morning, that oftentimes Black male scholars they have to kind of master the Western or the weird, tradition, and their own, right? Their own Black American tradition. But Black women have to do both of those and the tradition coming out of Black women's literature and traditions and stuff. So in many ways, Black women are the widest and deepest informed about so many of these things. And like you say, there's being ignored, not even asked certain questions that the answers are right there if you would just ask. So now I've said enough as a Black male. And so I would like to have you, Imani, pass it on to Loretta and Toni so we can get into some of these issues a little more deeply. I think maybe a good place to start would be with a definition or description of exactly what reproductive justice is. So Loretta.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, because
please, yes.
Oh yeah, because I think I'm interested in both the meaning of reproductive justice, but Dr. Bond, you said in our meeting, our pre-meeting, one of the things that you talked about was coming from different generations, and I would love actually to hear your wisdom from your respective generations of organizing, the things that we need to know that are not being attended to, from that history, would be, be helpful for everyone, but including me. So.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, Imani. Yes, please.
I'm going to defer to my elder Loretta. Let you go first.
Well, I also feel that I'm just channeling the wisdom of my elders. I came into my consciousness when I was 16, and I was lucky enough to be in Washington, D.C. And so I learned about feminism through the lens of Black women. I didn't even know there were white feminists until much, much later, because when I went to Howard University, and there were so many brilliant Black women on faculty at Howard University who made an impression on me. The first political book in my hands was The Black Woman by Toni M. She hadn't even added Bambara to her name at that time. That and the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was like my Black feminist intersection at the age of 16. But I want to pay tribute to the Dorothy Heights, the Shirley Chisholm, the Ruth Sykes, the Elton James Williams. These were women who passed on to me the legacy of Mary McLeod Bethune that they knew, the women in the Roosevelt generations. And they're the ones that didn't give up on the insufferable me when I was young and mouthy and thought that I knew everything. And they didn't like me, but they didn't give up on me, which is also important because elders do that. They know that you're just acting out and that they can still see something in you despite that, because you can imagine when I showed up with these baby dreads popping up all over my head in 1980, I looked like buckwheat to them. They didn't know what in the world was going on with my hair when they were all blue, blue haired and laid to the side kind of thing with their respectability hats on and thing. And so I feel privileged that before I even entered the white women's wing of the movement, I'd already experienced the Black feminist tradition. And so I felt very secure in my feminism, and I was there when a lot of white women entered the movement. So I knew their when and where they're into stories. So I never felt, in fact, I've always been pained when people say the white women's movement, because that erases all these women I know who were part of that movement. And it particularly hurts when it's said by other Black women who are more invested in research than research. So they don't know that they're standing on the shoulders of these giants, and they think if they have an original thought about Me Too or violence against women or reproductive justice, that somehow they're the first ones to think of it. But that's so not true. But in terms of the definition of reproductive justice, I'm probably going to pitch that to Toni, but I can say that it was our lived experiences as Black women that knew that we had to carve a space that centered us in the lens, because unlike our counterparts in the movement, uh, who are always forced to breed in kind of ways, see, since slavery, the women who were forced to breed were white women. That was kind of interesting, and most people don't understand what shift that took place when our fertility was criticized. This was no longer profitable to the slavocracy. And so the different standpoints produce different reactions to reproductive control. And I gave up a long time ago trying to convince white women to understand Black women when I realized they didn't even understand how to be appropriate white women, because they didn't understand their own history and how whiteness performed on gender within their ranks and stuff like that. So, and I'll just say one other thing before I pass it to Toni. Even my writing was born on the situation and the lived experiences of Black women. Because in 1986, when I was on NOW's staff, I was told that I needed to organize women of color for the first march for abortion rights. And I looked at Eleanor Smith and said, wait a minute, we don't even say the A word. What are you talking about? How am I going to convince Black women to support abortion rights? And that's when I saw that there was so much of our missing history that had not been documented. That there were, Black women were the ones that demanded that birth control clinics be placed by Margaret Sanger in New York neighborhoods, as opposed to being the victims, as the anti-abortion movement tries to say. We were the architects of our reproductive justice activism, that Black women reduced our fertility in half post-slavery, long before Margaret Sanger was even born. And so our ownership of the reproductive health rights and justice movement is totally understated. And it's up to us as the generations who now benefit from this history to tell those stories in a different way. But I'm going to pitch the ball to Toni to talk about the definition of reproductive justice and how it's blossomed since 1994.
Sure. So reproductive justice is about the human right to personal and bodily autonomy. And it is about the right for people to be able to have children, to decide not to have children. Also about the right to be able to parent the children that one has with the necessary social and economic supports so that families don't just survive, but thrive. People need, in order to be able to thrive, they need access to living wages, to clean water, to safe housing, to living in communities without fear of community and state-based violence. It is also about the right to sexual pleasure and acknowledging that we are human beings who are sexual beings and have a right to experience that level of eroticism that one experiences when they are sexual, when they experience and enjoy sexuality. Reproductive justice rests upon or is grounded in the human rights framework and also in Black feminist thought. And it uses an intersectional analysis. I will say it's interesting, Loretta, that and both you and Imani say, talking about being raised or having your initial grounding be in Black feminism. And I'm just the opposite. So the very first rally I went to, I'm originally from Chicago. The very first rally I went to, I think I was about 16 or so, it was a now rally and it was filled with white women. But I remember this activist, she passed several years ago, named Sue Perrington, and she was talking about her abortion experience. And I was stuck there listening to her because she was talking about something that I had went through at 12, having an abortion. But it was my mother who insisted that I have an abortion. So there was some thinkings or some leaning towards bodily autonomy and reproductive autonomy within my family. It was not until I actually went to college that I learned about Black feminism. It wasn't until I went to seminary that I learned about womanism. But I have to say, as I think back, my very first encounter, and this is probably why I was so drawn to Loretta and the other women who were the founding mothers of reproductive justice. That was my first experience, I think, with Black feminist thought and seeing it in action, right? To see the theory and practices come together. That was the very first encounter I had with it. And I think that was, and it spoke to me, right? It spoke to the lived experiences that I had and the way that we were talking about this framework, this budding framework that we were creating. It came because we were bringing not just our own lived experiences, but most, if not all of us, worked in communities around the country. And so we were bringing the stories and the lived experiences of the Black women that we knew, that we worked with on the ground in communities, either trying to help folks get access to safe abortion services, get access to contraceptives, get support getting out of domestically violent relationships or working with rape survivors, and also the stories from our families and our friends. And so we were bringing all of that, I think, to this meeting of the minds, if you will, in 94 in Chicago.
Okay, you mentioned a phrase that I'd like us to delve into and perhaps unpack. You mentioned intersectionality. And I first came across that term when I was doing graduate work in the late 90s in American Studies at NYU, where critical race theory and critical theory were foundational because cultural studies at NYU was actually grounded in British cultural studies, Stuart Hall, and others, Thompson, I forget his first name. And this intersectionality concept, when we look at the critique of critical race theory, of intersectionality, I think some people don't even know what that is. So can we explain what intersectionality is and means?
Sure. So it's important to say that intersectionality, the naming of it, and you're right, critical race theorists were um, approaching the conversation about critical race theory through this lens of intersectionality, but it was Kimberly Crenshaw who came along and gave it its name. She named it intersectionality. And it really is about the ways that race, class, gender, age, sexual orientation, all of those issues and forms of oppression operate simultaneously, not individually, and impact an individual's ability um, to achieve human rights and liberation. But I love the way Kimberly Crenshaw explains it. She says that if you think about being in the intersection of a road, right? And you've got, a line coming up the road coming across vertically and and horizontally both ways. And that individual is in the center. And so the oppression of race goes over them, the oppression of age, the oppression of gender, and it all happens simultaneously. And that it is about the ways that our identities are oftentimes, you have to understand that it's how our identities oftentimes impede or serve as forms of oppression that are used against us. And so individuals suffer these multiple forms of oppression all at the same time. And so if you imagine what it's like to get out from under, unpack those layers of oppression that an individual is experiencing all at the same time, it's very difficult. And so that's what I think Kimberly Crenshaw was lifting up. And that is what the reproductive justice framework lifts up. The fact that if, for instance, a woman who is seeking care for an abortion, who's needing to get an abortion, oftentimes it's not just the need of the abortion, but she may also be experiencing financial barriers. She may be experiencing distance barriers because she might live in a rural community and the nearest abortion clinic is hundreds of miles away. She also might be in a relationship filled with intimate partner violence. And so she's got all of these forces operating at the same time that are impeding her, making it difficult for her to be able to get to the abortion clinic.
Okay, thank you. Imani, would you like to come in and share? Because it's been a minute since we heard from you.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking a little bit earlier about how I came to intersectionality, which was both through law school, but also through an experience in college. I had two, as a theoretical framework. I had two experiences. One, I took a class called Sociology of Culture, and I read this book by Patricia Hill Collins, Black Feminist Thought, and I was bowled over. It's actually, so I apologize to the professor because I never went to class, but I read everything. And so, and I said that, but the readings were made, and I remember going home for break and telling my mother, this is what I want to do. And my mother said, oh, I know Pat. Pat used to work at the community school, right? And that was really, in some ways, why I think it resonated so deeply, because, she had been a teacher at my godmother, who was a nun, had started a Black nationalist school in a former Catholic school, St. Joseph's Community School, right? And was a nun and also very clearly a feminist, right? And a Black nationalist and above, right? So what I'm trying to say is, and Collins talked about matrices of domination, right? Like, so which is, it's coextensive with intersectionality. The piece that really stuck with me at that point was in which she said, you can be oppressed and oppressor at the same time, depending upon where you're located. And for me, it was this sort of like aha moment, because we do participate when we are oppressed, we still often participate in the oppression of others. And so in order to have a deep political consciousness, that has to be unpacked too, right? Being oppressed does not become an excuse for not engaging with the question of the oppression of others. And then subsequently, Collins reading Crenshaw's work and talks about intersectionality explicitly as well. And so I also love this idea. And we said we were going to talk about this. I hope we do, about just also Black feminist, womanist, right? That we have these terms, these concepts that move around each other, that are not at odds, but are part of a sort of large community of thought. Just really quickly, I had a similar experience when I saw Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust. And I went up to her after seeing it. I was a student, and I said, I want to do that, right? And she started telling me about film, and I was like, I don't mean I want to be a filmmaker. I want to do what you did, like produce the effect of that film, which was about community and tradition and transformation and grief and sexual violence and the divisions of aspirations and assimilationist aspirations versus holding on to traditional ways. So in some ways, to go with what Toni said about what intersectionality as a form of analysis does, is it tells a full, is right, and it's right because it tells a full analysis of who we are and where we come from. And that's the thing that to me felt like the most important reason to go into writing and thinking for a living.
Can I just say one thing about intersectionality, though?
Of
I
course.
really appreciate the way Kim named it, but she named what Black women had identified since
Yeah,
Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I
that's
a
right.
woman?"
That's right. Yeah.
And then, you had Fran Beal, who wrote
Yes,
Double Jeopardy
that's right.
in the
Yeah.
1960s. And so we always, again, have to realize that nothing is new. We learn new nomenclature for what has existed in Black women's consciousness since we were kidnapped and brought over here, the same way that the Africans who came over here brought knowledge of abortions and birth control, abortifacients and birth control, with the indigenous African knowledge that they used on plantations to keep from having kids and
Yes.
stuff. And so we always have to honor these legacies and not assume that because we get the privilege of naming something in modern lexicon, that means that we invented the concept no more than Newton invented gravity. He just named it. So we have to
Okay.
keep that perspective.
Yes, thank you for
That's so
grounding us
important.
in that and reminding us of that. So what I would like to find out from you all is one of the things we said we would discuss is art and spirituality and liberation. And I want to approach it from this angle. Yes, there are structures of domination and oppression, clearly, and we have to read it, to use your term and Vexy thing. We have to learn how to read these things. So from a particular angle, there's a strong postmodern analysis of power dynamics. At the same time, we also know, we've alluded to it, but I want to really go in on it. We have a tradition not only of survival, but of resilience. We have a tradition of making a way out of no way. We have a tradition of keeping the faith in the midst of the tragedy and the surreal absurdity of so much of what we've had to go through. Let's speak about that for a moment. That's a key part of your book, Imani. And I know by even just in the conversation we had to prepare for this, that those elements are strong there and are part of what makes our culture such a powerful force, not only for us as Black folks, but is a magnet and is attractive to others because they can see and say, if those people can go through all that and come out with all of this beauty, how do you, all this soul, all this grace, it's elegance. So can we talk about that too? And you know where I'm coming from, Imani. You know I'm coming out of that Ellison Murray. You know where I'm coming from.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's this is a continue this at this very moment, this is like this is a challenging thing for me to talk and think about, because I have long been a believer in distinguishing between, the fact of being oppressed and the ugliness that heaps upon us and the condition of Blackness, which I think is an extraordinarily beautiful thing, right? So it is a beautiful thing to be Black, but it is also a hard thing. And I think a lot about what it means to understand that the resilience is born from the incredible beauty and love that exists in Black communities, and also that there's a lot of work that we need to do, in Hortense Spiller's term, with the intramural within our communities, to have the kind of tenderness and beauty in how we engage with each other that we put in our art and creativity and all those sorts of things. And so I always am trying to figure out how to talk in a way to hold on to both of those things, right? Like, so that we're both not telling these stories that people often like to tell. It everything about Blackness is terrible and deficient, right? That's a lie. But also not to use the beauty as an excuse not to confront what we must confront, right? And so it's not really an answer, but I feel like that question has come to a head right now for me. How to strike the appropriate balance.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Okay.
I want to pick up on that because my first work in the women's movement was as the third executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, and at the time, Chocolate City was 80% Black. And so when we were talking about violence against women, we were talking about intra-racial violence, what brothers were doing to sisters. And of course, coming at it from a Black nationalist point of view, I was like, how in the world are we going to make a Black revolution when half the army is brutalizing the other half? I mean, this just does not make logical sense to me, brother.
Right.
And yet we were pilloried
Right.
for drawing attention to the violence that was happening within our community, is that we were selling out to the man,
Right.
betraying the Black community. And I used to walk around and tell people, I'm a Black feminist because I want better men. Not because I hate men, because I just want better ones. You know? and but it was always a struggle to get that conversation going, because not only did you have some Black men, not all Black men, who wanted to establish a Black patriarchy, but you had so many Black women supporting them in wanting to establish a Black patriarchy. And so the internalized white supremacy in our community has always been very thick. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about that, and that at the DC Rape Crisis Center, we worked with some incarcerated Black men, because I don't want to say we started it. They started a program called Prisoners Against Rape. These were incarcerated Black men who had raped and murdered Black women who were serving life sentences for rape and murdering Black women. But
Wow.
they reached out to us because they didn't want to be rapists anymore, because outside they raped women, inside they raped men. And so they had the consciousness to say, we want to live life differently. And so, as a rape survivor, going into Lorton Reformatory and trying to teach Black feminist theory like bell hooks and stuff to these brothers was transformative for me, because I was confronting what was my demons, because all the violence that I'd ever experienced was at the hand of Black men, not white. White supremacy was a system to me, but it wasn't a lived experience in terms of how I got raped and incested. And so these conversations we need to have in our community are so urgent and crucial, and still need to be had. I love the work that Brittany Cooper's doing when she talks about the Black patriarchy representing failed patriarchs, and why we need to come up with a new way of looking and being in the struggle for Black liberation against white supremacy. And nothing is off the table, because what I'm also concerned about is the rise of Black conservative thought that manifest a strong anti-Blackness. You know, the Black folks who think that they need to be in critique of critical race theory and misquote Dr. King, you know, that the color of our skin, you know, the content of our character, they sound like, you know, Ted Cruz running that crazy stuff at us. And so there's so many layers to what we need to talk about. I'm proud for the progress we've made, but I can also see how far we still need to go.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on what both of you are saying, Imani and Loretta. And Imani, that last part of that sentence that Greg put up, the moral imagination of being in right relation with others in the world. And so it sounds like what you are talking about is, what does it mean to be in right relationship within the Black community with each other? And I think about just, what was it, yesterday or day before yesterday, the little 7-year-old girl in Chicago who was shot 7 times. And that was within the Black community. And so we need to talk about what it means to be in right relationship, and talk about the violence that happens within the Black community. But at the same time, one of the reasons why womanist theologians came up with womanist theology is because they were saying, the framework of Black liberation theology that we got from James Cone is all well and good, and it talks about race, but it doesn't talk about gender. And so that's why womanist theologians took Alice Walker's womanism and applied it to the work that they were doing, because it gave them a way to talk about this balance between the individual and the environment and nature and spirituality. And it also gave us a way to apply a lens of what it meant to be a Black woman moving through this world, and to talk about our religion, Christian religion, and to examine our traditions and our faiths, and to apply a Black woman's interpretation of even what the biblical text looks like. And at the same time, yes, when we talk about the resiliency of Black people, of the Black community, it also, I think, and this is what you were doing, Imani, when you talk about what it means to be in right relationship with others in the world, calling into question that, even that resiliency, and having to make a way out of no way. We shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't have to suffer and be forced to make a way out of no way in order to be able to thrive and live in this world as human beings who have a human right to live free from violence, and to be able to grow and thrive and have access to the economic and social resources that we need, and to be able to have a political voice.
So true. So true. Someone asked a question about intergenerational trauma. And for me, this is something that within the last year and a half, I've really been delving in more so than I ever have before. And I'll say that I think it's an area that I revere the work of Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray, but as heavy modernists and being men in the generation they were, and it's a new subject anyway, intergenerational trauma is not something that we have dealt with. So someone asked a question to Loretta about, how do you deal with intergenerational trauma? And I think that's something that, for me, reading the work of Resmaa Menakem has been very, very deeply informative for me about intergenerational trauma in the Black community, amongst whites, and amongst police. That's the frame he deals with in My Grandmother's Hands. So Loretta, if you could start.
Now, I always contextualize intergenerational trauma because it's not restricted to any one race, one gender identity, whether it's trans issues, homophobic issues, gender or race issues. Um, and so I don't want us again to think that we've created something new because we've named it. One of the reasons that I take a lot of pride in having done this work for 50 years and get paid to do it is that my mother raised 8 children when she started out as a domestic worker, and she had her own intergenerational trauma, but it didn't stop her from giving all she could to not only her children, but to her community. And my father came over here as an immigrant. Never did graduate from high school till he retired from the Army and went back on the GI Bill and got a GED and a college degree after he retired from the post office, after he retired from the Army. And they did all of those things with their own version of intergenerational trauma. Now, what I love about our current discussions about it is that now that we can name it, we can attend to it, because heretofore it affected the way we were in relationship with each other, the way we parented our children, the way we neglected ourselves and made martyrs of ourselves in terms of trying to save not only ourselves but our families and our communities. We like Zora said, the mules of the world kind of thing. We thought that that was our due, that we thought that that was our obligation. And the fact that we understand that we can name it now is revelatory, but its existence is not something that we can claim that only started with those of us that can name it. Because I thank God every day that I get to do my work sitting on my butt instead of, my mother was judged by how many scars she had on her knees that proved that she cleaned white folks' houses on her hands and knees. And so I'll never take for granted the privilege that I have right now, even as I understand that I'm a victim of intergenerational trauma. I'm always going to keep it in perspective of how many people suffered and died for me to get here to talk about Zoom fatigue. I mean, really?
Okay. Now you just triggered me. You just triggered me. I gotta say this, and this is gonna be. I'm 57, so I gotta say, and y'all teach young people, and I've taught young people too, and I do, but not like you all. Okay. That when I started hearing about they were being triggered when they would hear certain words and safe spaces and stuff, and I started wondering what would happen if they went back to the 19th century, like in one of those skits by what's his name? Oh, great comedian, where he went back into slavery times. What's his name? Oh, anyway, what if they went back and they started explaining to folks in Reconstruction about safe spaces and being triggered by hearing the word nigger? I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but it's like, and I don't mean to be insensitive, but good Lord, what our ancestors have gone through, really? Okay, so Imani, you wanna?
So, you know what that makes me think of? I was very close to my grandmother, very close. And she used to tell me, she used to say, my auntie always said, you weren't born to live on flower beds of ease. And I took that. I mean, I will say, I think people, are made for the time they live. So I am sensitive to young people because there's certain kinds of things, that I think shouldn't be so hard, but they are also often at the cutting edge of insisting upon people acting in just ways. And so, so there's a give and take, but I do think that testimony for me was about, she transmitted it to us as a way of saying, you shouldn't expect things to be easy, but reading it not as a kind of defeat, but you were built to be tough, right? That's what, you weren't born for flower beds of ease. You were born for something. And so I didn't take it as a, I don't know, I didn't take it as sort of saying, you shouldn't complain as much as you have what it takes to navigate this world and this life. But I will say, relatedly, every single work that I have ever done has come out of something that my grandmother said to me or showed me. Everything.
Wow.
She's at the center of my concern. And, and she's a person who I watch read every single day. She's a person who would tell me about how do you navigate people who want you to do too much when you clean their houses, spray Pine Sol around a lot, right? But actually you kind of like the tricks of navigating a space. And so even though my life has been very different, the ethos that she taught me, right, which is she raised 12 children, conceptions of how to raise children, how to raise people to be decent, how to pray for them, how to pray for oneself, are important. But even if my life is totally different, right, that there's a kind of instructive disposition that has, which is not, and she had a core trauma. Her mother died when she was 2 years old. And it is a core trauma that we all knew about all of our lives. We were very aware of it. We felt it. It hurt, right? But she also taught, let me think about a way to say this. My grandmother taught me small pleasures, right? The joy of a straw, right? A plate, a bowl of watermelon, right? The things that you could enjoy that were not, and I guess to me, that's a way of, I love Gwendolyn Brooks' phrase, living in the along, right? And that's part of the way we, obviously we want transformation. Therapeutic interventions are important, but she taught me ways of caring for oneself in the bits and pieces. And I guess that's that's the part that I learned to kind of push back against the terms of suffering, right? That are very real, but like how to, on a day-to-day basis, be sweet to yourself, be sweet to the people around you. Try to make, making do doesn't mean, refusing yourself. It actually means you have to have the spaces of tenderness.
Self-care.
Yeah.
Self-care. I wish, I'm going to say this.
Not a spa day, because she didn't, right? I mean, that wasn't, she didn't have spa days and stuff.
Right.
Yeah, Pepsi with a straw. Yes.
I hear you. Just for those who are into, postmodern literature and writers, I wish they would check out more of Foucault's late work, where he talked about care of self. Check that out. It wasn't just all the, structural and systemic. He dealt with towards the end of his life. So I just want to plant that little seed. But please, Loretta, Toni.
Well, for me, I always bring Foucault into conversation with Fanon, because that self-colonization of your mind that Foucault addresses, but Fanon identified as one of the legacies of colonialism, is what foundational to understanding Black women's emphasis on taking care of self means that you can then take care of others, as opposed to sacrificing self to take care of others. But you first have to decolonize your mind to know that you're worthy of taking care of self, because you're receiving so much from the world saying that you're not worthy, and even from how they define Black mothering in the Black community, as if we are supposed to be sacrificed for the health and well-being of the community, not that we're supposed to thrive so that the community can thrive. And so there's a bad patriarchal bargain happening within our community, and then Black women internalize this. And I think Toni could talk about this even more than I can, because she studies it so deeply entrenched within the Black church.
Unmute yourself, please, Toni.
The womanist theologian Dolores Williams talks about this whole notion of suffering and the relationship in Christian thought that Christianity has with the cross, and the relationship of Black women and Christianity and the cross. And I believe, as she does, that suffering is not a badge that we have to wear to show our relationship with, our allegiance to the Christian tradition. Learning, lived experience is important. And learning from those lived experiences is of value, but suffering is optional. And I don't think that we have to suffer. And this whole notion that we, some kind of way the Black church has grasped hold of, that suffering is necessary and critical to our political and spiritual liberation, I completely disagree with. I also think that, the truth is that for many, a lot of Black people, we walk in a sense of a state of religious pluralism. We're not necessarily all Christian. I am, I live at the intersection of being Christian and also a member of the Ifa tradition, because of my understanding that one evolves out of the other. I think what the younger generation of activists are teaching those of us who've been doing this for a minute is about how to care for yourself. I think that Loretta's generation, my generation, I'm part of the middle generation, right? I think we have done it so poorly. We don't take care of ourselves. We work too many hours in one day. We don't eat right. We don't get enough sleep. Like, I don't think that we've been a really good role model for what it means to take care of yourself and to practice self-care. I still call Loretta and say, I need you to get some sleep. I need you to take care of yourself. I have people who call me and say, I need you to stop working. So I think we still don't get it right. And I think that that is the gift one of the gifts that the younger generation of activists are presenting to us, but we still refuse to take it. But I think it's an important gift because that is where you find your regeneration from in order to be resilient. And so I think that there's a lot for us to learn from the younger activists about what it means to self-care and to take care of yourselves.
I love that, particularly how we have to look out for each other, that interpersonal, intersubjective relationship where we are so on what we've got to do, our work, whatever that work is, and we are like, and sometimes we need, Jewel and I, my wife and I, we do this. It's like, sometimes we just have to like take up and go somewhere. We're working like we have our own business, so we're like working 7 days a week. Sometimes you just have to chill. Yeah. You got to rejuvenate, regenerate, but we also have to point out to others. I love how you said, Toni, how you say to Loretta, hey, we have to really look out for each other that way. Now, we talked about an intergenerational dynamic here. I like to go even younger here for a moment and ask Kaya Thomas, who has the same last name as me somehow, to unmute herself because, because I would like her to share a bit about an app that she helped to create that's in the vein of this discussion. And I won't even name it, I'll let her do it. So Kaya, could you please come on and join us for a moment?
Hello, I'm so excited to be here, and this conversation you all have been having is just so amazing. I'm just in awe of all three of you. Thank you so much for everything you've done. The app I wanted to share with you all is called the Earth app, and the founder of the app is Kimberly Sears Aller. She's a writer, author, and journalist in the maternal health space and focus on trying to combat the issue of Black maternal death. And so she had this idea for an app to allow women of color to review their experiences with healthcare practitioners so that she can then use that data to hold healthcare practitioners accountable. And so the app is available in the App Store and the Google Play Store for birthing people of color to share their prenatal, postpartum, birth, and pediatric experiences and talk about their doctors and the hospitals that they've been at, in hopes that we can try to better hold healthcare practitioners accountable. So definitely in the vein of the conversation that you've all been having, but thank you so much for Dad for allowing me to share a bit about it.
Absolutely, Kaya, thank you so much. And I think now would be a good point for Peter to come in, and let's let some folks, we can say everyone unmute yourself and let some folks.
make
Yes,
one
please,
small
Loretta.
commercial?
Of course, please. Oh, yes, you've got a course coming up, right?
Right, that's what I wanted
Yes.
to talk about.
Okay.
You mentioned my upcoming book called Calling in the Calling Out Culture. And on Wednesday night, I'm starting a course for the African American community and the Black community called Calling in the Calling Out Culture in the Black community. How do we throw shade on each other? And it's only $5 a lecture for a total of $20 for 4 lectures. And you can find out more information on my website, lorettajross.com, because we need to have conversations about how we are feeling to support each other, kind of like what happened to Patrice Cullors. And, you know, we jump down on everybody's successes if they're from our community because we've internalized that white supremacy notion that we didn't deserve it or it got stolen. So I wanted to talk about that starting
I'm
on
so
Wednesday
glad.
night. And I'm co-training with Sonia Renee Taylor, who's the author of The Body Is Not an Apology. And I'm also holding a general one for all people starting June 1. So I just want people to know that we're going to be continuing this conversation about how to build bigger, badder, stronger Black communities.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Loretta, for sharing that. And Peter, if you could let some folks come in to ask a question or make a comment.
Cool. So everyone, feel free to turn on your video. We won't have time for all the questions, maybe one or two, but let's take in Margaret first. Margaret, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Peter. Thank you all so much. This has been very nourishing. And thank you for your work and resilience. My question was around nourishing and rejuvenation, which is, are you able to share what nourishes you, what rejuvenates you, and how you find right relationship with weariness when it comes?
Beautiful question. Thank you, Margaret.
Young people are like an energy source to me. It's like plugging myself into an electric socket of soul force when I interact and teach young people. Oh God, I never feel old when I'm around young people because they just make me feel like I'm blossoming all over again because they're so drop dead brilliant and creative and energetic. They're like my crack cocaine. I love young people. You know, I can't get enough of them, you know, and so that's why my third career is teaching because I just love the energy, the passion, the freshness, the dedication that young people bring and the way that their minds are developing their guideposts for how they want to live with integrity in the world is a fascinating project to me. And then they overthink so much, so they always sparkling my brain even more. It's like, oh my God, I'm used to people with simple questions. I've yet to have a young person bring a simple question to me, and that's my source of replenishment. I have to honestly say.
That's wonderful.
I would say for me, it's reading, you know, the quiet space of reading, conversations with friends that are both intimate and fun and funny, right? So, you know, you have a wide ranging conversation that goes from what you're anxious about, tears, jokes, you know, all of that together, the long conversations. My children, who are so much fun, I mean, they just really are, and water, whether it's, you know, I'm so thankful for hot water, and I've had hot water for virtually all my life, but every time I get in the shower or the bath, I'm thankful for hot water. It's just it's a luxury, you know. And so I think it's those things. For me, it's the small things that make days better. Yeah.
How about you, Toni?
So you made me think about a comment that Loretta made for me. Basically, she said, I have a quirky musical taste. So it would be music. What that nourishes me. I like all kinds of music. And a small little known fact that from 16, 17 to like 25, 26, I sang professionally. No, I will not sing for you.
And I didn't even that.
So that gave me that is why I like everything from Aretha Franklin to Sting to Aria to like the only genre I'm not real keen on is country and western. Yeah. But everything else I love. And so I put some music on. I have my own little mini concert. I said I'm from Chicago, and that is the home of house music. So I'll also have a dance party, reading, and talking to my good sister friends. I host a weekly call that I started doing in March of last year because of the pandemic, where some of us just get on the call every Friday, and the conversations are good, they're heated, and that rejuvenates me. How I find right relationship with weariness, sleep. For me, if I just lay my body down, that helps me with the weariness that I experience. Yeah.
The only time I feel weary is when I find myself battling internalized white supremacy in my own community.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
When we turn on each other, when we can't accept other people being successful without criticizing them, when we become that circular firing squad of disappointment and anger. Because the thing with trauma that I've learned a long time ago working with Black women is that we never turn the trauma outward towards the people that oppressed us. We turn it to whoever's accessible to us, often the one trying to help us and stuff, but they're accessible, they're close, they're trusted. So I can act like a Mau Mau on you because I know you won't come back at me.
That's right.
You won't fire me. You know, the hardest thing in the world is to manage a whole staff of traumatized women, particularly traumatized Black women. And so that's what's so emotionally weary. That's when I feel weary because I know I want us to do better, but I also want to respect the trauma, but I also want people to be in integrity with each other and not use the excuse that hurt people get to hurt people. That isn't working for me. We're all hurt people, and you get to make choices about whether or not you're going to become a victimized violator. That is not inevitable and stuff. And so weariness is not a time of work or effort or even the fact that I stay very focused on fascism. I'm digging into the vomit of human relations professionally. That's what I do. But I don't ever feel tired till I look at how Black people brutalize each other when all we trying to do is lift each other up.
Can I say something really quick related to that? Because
yes,
for me,
please.
Because for me, an aspect of that, since we were talking about mothers a moment ago, is shame, and the sort of as part of the burden that Black mothers carry, shame is part of it. And the shame, it's not just your shame, it's the shame of others, anybody who you have. So both all of the responsibility and all of the blame, and the way that we feed into each other's shame with judgment. And so that's another piece of the very same thing that Loretta is talking about, that I think we ought to work to undo, the sort of ease with which we will judge others of our community, knowing that we often feel the very shame that we're saying they ought to feel. So.
Okay. I do want to just presence a comment that a good friend of mine, Amil Handelsman, made. He referenced you, Imani, when you were talking about generations of Black feminists being for everyone's liberation. I think several of you said that. He said, this reminds me of one of the core themes of Martha Jones's book, Vanguard, about creating political power that would promote the equality, the equal dignity of all people. Could you say more about what you mean by being for everyone's liberation?
Yeah, and I want to actually tag on to something that Loretta said earlier about the long genealogy behind intersectionality, you start with the context of slavery, and Black women are dominated and expected to produce reproductively and also in the fields, right? So that there is Black women in occupying positions that are not accorded just to women, but facing a very particular racialized and gendered form of oppression, allowed from the beginning a window into all of the ways people were dominated, right? And an understanding that, when we will know we are free is when we are free, right? I mean, because sitting under all of these layers. So, yeah, and Martha Jones' work is extraordinary for retelling the story of suffrage, retelling the story of civil rights. I mean, I think every time, and there's so many wonderful scholars doing this, and for me, it's a testimony as to why it's really important for us to read each other and attend to each other. Right?
Wonderful. Can we, if you all can stay for just a few more minutes, we're closing, but I want to get at least one more in, Peter, and I'll let you feel that for someone who may want to ask a question on camera.
I think Richard Bartlett would be a good question to end with. Richard, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really such a pleasure and an honor to witness. I'll try to keep it brief. It could be a big question, but I just want to hear some of y'all reflect on this question of polarization. Like, I have a mental model that, like, every action has the seeds of its counteraction in it. That if society is like a rowboat and suddenly everyone lurches to one side, other people are going to have to lurch to the other side to like have some sense of balance. And so I'm just curious how you think about how to move wisely in an increasingly polarized society, and how to take a stand for something, how to stand for justice without fueling its opposite, without kind of giving fuel to its enemy. And that's a big one. I just want to know how you sort of think about that.
I do want to say, I'm just going to take the moderator's prerogative to give a quick answer. It's unavoidable, Richard. If you take a stand, there are going to be people, based on whatever they're bringing to it, they see how you look, the points you're making, there will be people who will react. So the question is, do you have the integrity to stand for and on something and have a depth of knowledge about it and a depth of experience that you can draw upon, okay? So I'll just leave it there, because I'm sure you all have your own comments, but I think that's inevitable to a certain extent.
I know that I believe that to a certain form of white supremacist ideology, and I separate white supremacy ideology from the identity of whiteness, because obviously everybody white is not a white supremacist, and certainly not every white supremacist is white. So I got that. But to that certain brand of white supremacist ideology, Blackness itself is an existential threat. You don't have to take a stand. Just that you exist is a threat. That's why we got driving while Black, parking while Black, barbecuing while Black, bird watching while Black. They ain't done nothing but exist. And so I think it's a false narrative to say that the polarization exists because of what Black people do or don't do. It's not that Black folks are so much divided, it's that white America is in the fight for its soul. It's white people who are divided on whether they support democracy more than they support white supremacy. And the fact that they have yet to answer that question since the Civil War is what is polarizing our country. And we need to have white people who do not support white supremacy decide that question, because the rest of us are doing all we can. But we cannot decide that question for white America when white America refuses to decide it for itself. That's the polarization.
I don't have much more to add to what Loretta already said, but I think, Greg, you're right that conflict is unavoidable, and when you take a position, someone's always going to push against it. But I think that for me as a trained ethicist, it's important to me to always be thinking about, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, what my own personal moral precepts are, what it means for me to be in right behavior or right relationship with other people, what right action looks like for me. But that would be the only other thing that I would add to what Loretta said.
All right. Well, I would just like to ask if there would be any final comments from our guests before we close out. You have to take yourself off mute, Imani.
I just would say thank you again. It's just been such an honor to be in conversation with you all.
I like highly loving, highly intellectual conversations that are very accessible. And so this is a joy. Thank you, Greg and Peter, for organizing this, because this has been a love fest with some deep thinking.
Exactly. That's what it's about. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
It's been awesome.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Toni Bond, Loretta Ross, Imani Perry. Thank you all for creating the space that we shared today. And hopefully this will be the first among many such conversations.